The Indian Armed Forces are under the management of the Ministry of Defense of the Government of India. It's the world's second largest military force and it has the world's largest voluntary army. Now, India currently ranks 4th on the global scale for its military power. The Indian Armed Forces headquarters is located in New Delhi, India, and the Indian Armed Forces are made up of the following service branches. First up, we have the Indian Army. They take care of the land operations. The Indian Air Force, of course, the air, the Indian Navy, the seas, and also there's the Indian Coast Guard. When we look at the total manpower available in the Indian military, we see that there's 616 million people available. However, their active personnel sits at 1,362,500 personnel. And the personnel that they have in reserve is at 2,844,750. Now I want to move on into the military overview of Pakistan. So the Pakistan Armed Forces are ranked 13 in the entire world in terms of military power, and they're also the 6th largest in terms of active personnel, and they have the largest military amongst the Muslim countries. The Pakistan Armed Forces headquarters are at the Joint Staff Headquarters in Rawalpindi, Pakistan, and all of the branches work together during operations under the Joint Staff Headquarters. Pakistan's military has several branches, and those include the Pakistan Army, the Pakistan Navy, the Pakistan Air Force, then we have the Pakistan Marines, and the paramilitary forces. Pakistan's available manpower sits at a total of 95 million, and their active personnel is a total of 637,000. They have 282,000 reserve personnel. So that was your military overview of India and Pakistan. Now I want to talk a little bit about their special forces, starting off with India's special forces. The special forces of the Indian Armed Forces refer to those units that are under the direct command of the Indian military and specifically organized and trained to conduct and support just special operations. So you only calling these big guys when they're really needed for a specific task. The special forces under the Indian Army are the Para Special Forces, and this is a unit that was created in 1966, and the unit is responsible to go on missions such as hostage rescues, unconventional warfare, special reconnaissance, foreign internal defense, counterinsurgents, seek and destroy, as well as personnel recovery. Then in the Indian Navy, there's Marcos. The Marcos, or Marine Commandos, is a special force unit in the Indian Navy created for conducting special operations. And then under the Air Forces, there's the Garud Commando Force. And this unit is specifically designed to protect Indian Air Force installations from attacks coming in from enemies. Now, some other Indian special forces that you've probably heard of are the Gatak Force, the Special Frontier Force, and the National Security Guard. Moving on now into Pakistan's special forces. Under their army, they have the Special Service Group, commonly just known as the SSG. Now, this is a special operations force that is primarily responsible for 5 types of missions. There's foreign internal defense, reconnaissance, direct actions, counterterrorism, and unconventional warfare. Under Pakistan's Navy, there's the Navy Special Service Group, the SSGN for short, and this is a special operations force that conducts small unit-based military operations in all types of environments, including the sea, the air, and the land. And they're pretty versatile. They do this by adapting to the tactics of the unconventional warfare. Now, by the way, before I continue this episode, for more videos relating to Pakistan and India as nations on a whole, as well as videos about their militaries specifically, we have a playlist dedicated to these types of videos for both of these countries. Now, I'll have a link to the playlist in the card section of this episode, as well as I'll make sure that I link to those playlists below in the video description box, and of course I'll feature them at the end of this episode. So there are many videos that you gotta watch, and I highly recommend them if you really want to expand on the information that I'm sharing in this episode. Now, when we look at the army, these armies of India and Pakistan have really clashed 4 times in the past 70 years. And by the way, this doesn't include attacks that happen from time to time, but I'm talking about full-out battles. Now, when we look a little closer into India's army strength, we see that they have 4,426 combat tanks, 6,704 armored fighting vehicles, 292 rocket projectors, 7,414 towed artillery, and 290 self-propelled artillery. For Pakistan's army strength, this is how they compare. For their combat tanks, they sit at 2,924. Their armored fighting vehicles are a total of 2,828. Pakistan's army has 134 rocket projectors and 3,278 towed artillery. Their self-propelled artillery count sits at 465. Now, moving on to the air power of these nations, India's fighter aircrafts are a total of 676, and they have a total of 809 attack aircrafts. Their transport aircrafts total at 857. There are 323 training aircrafts, 666 helicopters, and 16 attack helicopters. Now let's see how Pakistan's air power compares, because the Pakistan Air Force has really been modernizing its inventory and improving a lot of its precision strike capabilities. Their fighter aircrafts are a total of 301. There's 394 attack aircrafts in their possession, 261 transport aircrafts, 190 trainer aircrafts, 316 total helicopters, and their attack helicopters are a total of 394. Now, the final aspect I'm looking at is their navy strength. In their possession, India has 295 total naval assets. There's 139 patrol crafts, 3 aircraft carriers, 14 frigates, 11 destroyers, 15 submarines, 23 corvettes, and 6 mine warfare vessels. And the numbers for Pakistan's navy strength look like this. They have 197 total naval assets, 17 patrol crafts, 10 frigates, 8 submarines, and 3 mine warfare vessels. When you look at the defense budget, India's defense budget, according to the latest numbers, is $58 billion US. India allocated 4 trillion rupees, or roughly 2.1% of its gross domestic product, all to support its troops. India's defense budget is the 4th largest in the entire world and will be about 12.1% of its annual spending. Pakistan's defense budget is a total of 11 billion. So Pakistan spent 1.6 trillion Pakistani rupees, and that's about 3.6% of its GDP. It's also received 100 million in foreign military assistance in the year 2018. Also, one thing to consider is that both of these nations have ballistic missiles. India has 9 types of operational missiles, and these missiles include the Agni 3 that has a range of 3,000 to 5,000 kilometers. Pakistan's missile program was built with Chinese assistance and includes mobile, short, and medium range weapons that can reach any part of India. First thing I want to talk about is India is the 2nd largest military in the entire world in terms of active personnel, and they sit behind China with a total active military personnel amount of 1,444,000. But in terms of total military power, they're 4th in the world behind China, Russia, and the United States. Also, when it comes to the military of India, specifically in the Indian Army, it's actually the world's largest standing volunteer army. So all serving and reserve personnel have actually opted for service, but there is a provision for conscription, which is forced recruitment in the Constitution of India, but it has never really been used. So that just goes to show you how eager Indians are to serve their country. Fact number 8 involves the 16th Light Cavalry, and that, by the way, was a regiment of the Armored Corps, and it was a primary combat arm of the Indian Army since it was formed back in the year 1776. You know, some sources say 1774. I guess it's just really a matter of when it was formed versus when it was actually active. But either way, that's besides the point. It's the oldest armored regiment created by the East Indian Company at Kolkata. So prior to India getting independence in the year 1947, it became a regular cavalry regiment of the British Indian Army. So the current form of the Indian Army actually has its origins from the East India Company's military department. Another interesting fact about India's military is Operation Rahat that happened back in the year 2013. Now, this was one of the biggest civilian rescue operations that was ever done in history. It was conducted by the Indian Air Force, and it was really to evacuate civilians that were affected by the floods in Uttarakhand. Now, according to the Indian Air Force, they actually claim that this is the biggest civilian rescue operation that has ever been conducted in the world by any Air Force using helicopters. The Indian Air Force, they ended up airlifting a total of 19,600 people. Now let's get into some specifics about the Indian military. Let's take a look at their numbers. First, I want to start off with their land systems. When it comes to total tanks, they have 4,292. Armored fighting vehicles sit at 8,686. They have 235 self-propelled artillery, 266 rocket projectors, and 4,060 towed artillery. Next up at fact number 5, let's talk about their air power. So the Indian military has a total of 538 fighter jets. Their attack aircraft total sit at 172. They have 250 transport aircraft in their possession, as well as 359 trainer aircraft. Also their helicopters, which have really come in handy, especially Project Rahat that I was talking about in this episode, 722 of them, and the attack helicopter count sits at 23. So when it comes to the Navy of the Indian military, they have total naval asset count of 285. They have 1 aircraft carrier, 10 destroyers, 13 frigates, 19 corvettes, 16 submarines, as well as they have 139 patrol crafts and 3 mine warfare vessels. Okay, so we just took a brief look at some of the specific assets in the Indian military. Now I want to take a look at their defense budget because, of course, all of that needs money to back it. So according to the latest numbers, India's defense budget for 2020 to 2021, that total was reported to be $73.65 billion US. And this was according to an official statement from the Indian government. But you know, officials and analysis, they're actually estimating that the amount is not even going to come close to meet the new demands for weapon purchases, as well as modernizing their military a lot more for India, because India is set to spend about 90% of its defense budget on existing expenses and obligations. So it leaves barely any room to advance and modernize their military. Also, the Indian Ministry of Defense had said that India will need $238 billion to meet its arms and equipment requirements in the next decade. And by the way, that number has been calculated according to the Long-Term Integrated Perspective Plan, or LTIPP for short, for the years 2012 up until 2027. Next thing I want to talk about is India's nuclear triad. So in late 2016, India completed its nuclear triad by actually adding a strategic nuclear submarine, the INS Arhant, into their military arsenal. Now, India has become one of the only countries to do this. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the term nuclear triad, it refers to the ability of a country to launch nuclear warheads from land, sky, and the seas. Now, this is very important to India's second strike capability because India had committed to a no first use policy when it comes to nuclear attacks. Now, the second strike capabilities refers specifically to the ability or the capability to strike back after being hit by a nuclear weapon first. We just actually hope that nuclear war, regardless of the country, never actually happens. But no doubt, the nuclear triad is a testament to the greatness and the power of the military of India. And the final fact I want to share regarding India's military in this episode is regarding its military achievements. So India has fought over 5 major battles with the neighboring countries, 4 with Pakistan and 1 with China ever since its independence. Also, India's military has experienced to fight in all kinds of terrain because there's everything from desert to high mountains, tropical forests, plateaus, valleys, deltas, you name it. So the Indian military, they do regular combat training in all kinds of surroundings and environments. So when it comes to combat time, yeah, they can handle themselves in pretty much any kind of environment. So that's a huge achievement right there. Also, though India is not part of any major military alliance, it does have very close strategic as well as pretty good military relationships with some of the most powerful nations in the world. Countries that consider India to be really close allies are Russia, Israel, Afghanistan, France, the United States, as well as Bangladesh. First military I'm going to be looking at is the Indian military. India has one of the most powerful militaries in the entire world. India's military is currently ranked 4th on the global scale for military power. And India has continued to develop their new technologies as well as manufacturing weapons, aircrafts, naval vessels, etc. And their military is only behind the USA, Russia, as well as China. Now looking into specifics, the manpower available in India is 616 million. They have 1,362,500 active personnel, and they have 2,844,750 personnel in reserve. Moving on now into the military of Bangladesh. The Bangladesh Armed Forces has consistently made a huge contribution to the United Nations peacekeeping operations. Now back in the year 2007, Bangladesh had major deployments in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Lebanon, Sudan, Liberia, and several other places. And with over 10,000 troops deployed, Bangladesh has one of the largest amount of troops contributing to countries in the world at the moment. And their available manpower is 37 million, and they have 160,000 active personnel, as well as their reserve personnel sits at 65,000. Okay, so now doing a side-by-side comparison with their army strength, India has 4,426 combat tanks, 6,704 armored fighting vehicles, they have 292 rocket projectors, and their total artillery is at 7,414, as well as their self-propelled artillery is at 290. In Bangladesh's army, they have 534 combat tanks, they have 942 armored fighting vehicles, 32 rocket projectors, and 18 self-propelled artillery. Now let's take a brief look at their power of their air forces. India's total amount of fighter aircraft sit at 676. Their attack aircrafts are at 809. They have 857 transport aircrafts, and they have a total of 323 trainer aircrafts. Total helicopters sit at 666, and their attack helicopters total at just 16. In Bangladesh's Air Force, they have 45 fighter aircrafts, 45 attack aircrafts, 65 transport aircrafts, and 53 trainer aircrafts, and their total helicopters are at 61. And the last part of their military we're going to look at is their navy. India has 295 total naval assets, and their patrol craft sit at 139. They have 3 aircraft carriers, 14 frigates, 11 destroyers, 15 submarines, as well as 23 corvettes and 6 mine warfare vessels. In Bangladesh's Navy, they have a total of 89 naval assets. They have 28 patrol crafts, 6 frigates, 28 corvettes, and 5 mine warfare vessels. Now, all of this is funded, of course, by a lot of money, and India's defense budget is at $51 billion. So India's defense budget is the 4th largest in the entire world. The Indian Army accounts for the biggest share in their defense budget, followed by the Indian Air Force, as well as their Navy, and the Defense Research and Development Organization, or the DRDO for short. Now, this is because the Army has a lot more people in it than other services in India. Now, Bangladesh's defense budget is a lot smaller than India's at $1.59 billion US. So the Bangladesh government has announced a defense budget of $3.2 billion US for the fiscal year of 2017 to 2018. So yeah, that number is going to be jumping real soon for Bangladesh. And this will also amount to about 6% of the total government spending, as well as about 1.25% of Bangladesh's GDP.